Hi, this is Frank, and welcome back to The Next Realignment. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the movement that created abolition, temperance, and women's suffrage, the Second Great Awakening. By the 1820s, the revival of the Great Awakening had long since burned out. After the American Revolution, Americans had turned their attention away from moral issues and towards more practical issues of building their new republic. See, America was now spreading west into the frontier. A generation of Americans had packed up all their belongings into Conestoga wagons, and they had carved new settlements out in what had previously been the wilderness. There were new cities springing up in the west, while the cities on the eastern coast were flourishing. And then something happened. The rumblings of a new revival began to stir. America was about to start its second Great Awakening, and this one would change America yet again. The first stirrings of religious revival really started in the first decade of the 1800s, with events like the revivals of James McCready out in Kentucky, because as the war had gotten further and further into the past, Americans now started thinking once again about questions of morality and religion. But it wasn't until the 1820s that all of a sudden this spirit of revival and reform just swept across the country like a great national brush fire. And the centerpiece of this revival movement was the tent revival. And the tent revival was like a multi-day combination of religious service and local carnival, and source for entertainment for a lot of communities out in the frontier, which often didn't really have access to much entertainment at all. And the centerpiece, of course, was religion and preaching, and the preachers would give passionate sermons in the style of the First Awakening, with shouting and crying and emotional appeals. But these revivals naturally also included a lot of entertainment. There would be singing and eating and drinking, and an opportunity from people from the entire region to socialize and get to know each other. And as they did that, there was also an opportunity to talk about things they wanted to change and about politics. By the time that a revival would roll out of town, the local community would often be completely changed. You'd see people who were now all of a sudden enthusiastic about religion again, and prepared to throw themselves into projects of morality and reform. The religious ideas of the Second Awakening were very different from the religious ideas of the first, because the religious ideas of the Second Awakening centered around the idea of millennialism, which is to refer to the 1,000-year reign of God's kingdom on earth. See, Second Awakening preachers believed that it was a precondition to the second coming and Christ's return that mankind would establish God's kingdom of earth. And this is as opposed to the popular alternative explanation, which holds that God's kingdom of earth will come about after Christ's return and the second coming. Now, Second Awakening preachers also believed that America was destined to become the heartland of God's kingdom on earth. Now, this is a very explosive idea, because what it means is that it is an urgent moral duty of every American to eradicate in America every conceivable injustice and wrong, because that's the way they can turn America into God's kingdom, a perfectly just and moral country. And turning America into a perfectly just and moral country is the precondition to the second coming itself. While the First Awakening was focused on one's individual relationship with God, the Second Awakening became obsessed with transforming America and the world. And as this message spread across the country, Christians caught up in Second Awakening religion began to passionately throw themselves into significant projects of social and moral reform. While the heart of the Second Awakening was with the tent revivals of the West, the head was pretty clearly in the churches of the Northeast. And this was a time when the Northeast was generally considered still to be the most religious part of the country. And the Northeast churches produced a whole new generation of leaders. leaders who were speaking and writing and providing moral guidance to this new movement. And not just becoming religious leaders of the Second Great Awakening, but also leaders of many of its causes of social and moral reform that the Second Awakening had taken up. The most famous of these was probably Lyman Beecher, the patriarch of the famous Beecher family, which included other figures like the preacher and abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But there were other important leaders as well, people like the abolitionist and preacher Charles Grandison Finney. The greatest hotbed of the Second Awakening turned out not even to be anywhere in the West, but rather Western New York State, an area that came to be called the Burned Over District. And it was called that because there'd been so many revivals that had burned over the area for so long, so many times, that it was generally considered that there was no more raw timber of revival left to set alight. The Second Awakening flourished throughout society, but particularly among women. And that meant women in particular flooded into these new causes for social reform. And that made the Second Awakening important because it also provided new opportunities for women to take on roles in public life that hadn't existed before. See, because the cause was morality and religion, it gave license for women to take on roles that would never have been available to them in normal political debate. They could speak in public. They could write. They could agitate for reform. They could even take on leadership roles within the movement. Now, this new leadership for women within the movement was not without controversy. Some people within the movement were in favor of it, and other people tried to limit the roles that women could take on. But at the end of the day, the Second Awakening created a new generation of women leaders in America. People like Susan B. Anthony, or the Grimke sisters, or Lucretia Mott. Of all the causes of the Second Awakening, none was greater than the abolition of slavery, with slavery's abolition becoming the chief moral issue of many awakening preachers, and many awakening preachers becoming abolitionist leaders themselves, people like Finney or Beecher, or other lay people fueled by awakening religion like William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of the very influential abolitionist Liberator newspaper. Slavery had been a contentious issue for a long time in America, but one that America's leaders had sought to avoid or push off in fear of tearing the country apart in violence or even war. But now there was a deeply passionate group of activists who simply did not care. To them, slavery was a moral evil. It was an urgent issue that had to be resolved right now, one that was standing in the way of the second coming of Christ. This was not an issue that you could compromise around or one that you could put off. It was one that you had to deal with and resolve right now. And if the result of that was violence or even war, then so be it. Second Awakening activists for abolition were religious, but that doesn't mean they were pacifists. In fact, many of them were quite comfortable with violence if that's what it was going to take to end the scourge of slavery. The rifles that anti-slavery activists used in the violence in Bleeding Kansas, they were frequently called Beecher's Bibles, and that's because the money to pay for them had often been raised in Eastern churches, and some of them had allegedly been shipped out to Kansas in boxes falsely marked books. Henry Ward Beecher was quoted as saying that there was more moral power in those rifles than there was even in the Bible. And then there were stories like that of John Brown, the famous abolitionist, and a very deeply religious man who considered himself the hand of God. And Brown, he was responsible for a bloody massacre. He and a group of men showed up in the middle of the night to the homes of pro-slavery leaders. He dragged them out of their homes and hacked them to death with swords. He's also responsible for the raid on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry, a raid that they hoped would seize weapons that they could use to arm a slave revolt. So, Second Awakening abolitionists, they believed that slavery was such a moral evil, there was nothing that wasn't morally justified in order to end it. Abolition, of course, wasn't the only cause of the Second Great Awakening. There was also the cause of temperance, which was a campaign to encourage people to moderate or eliminate their drinking, if not to ban alcohol entirely. See, Second Awakening preachers believed that alcohol was a dangerous and immoral substance because it damaged both the body and the soul. It damaged the body because it caused harm to your physical health, and your body was supposed to be a temple to God. But it also was damaging to the soul because drunkenness caused immoral behavior, behavior that would hurt both the individual but could hurt the entire community. And that a campaign was necessary because people who fell too far into drunkenness, they believed, often found themselves unable to stop. But many people also believed that temperance was an important social reform, one meant to benefit women and children and families, because the concern was that men would drink away their paychecks and they would come home unable to support their families, as well as potentially drunk and violent. So many women became attracted to the temperance movement because they saw it as a family-friendly reform and one that could fight back against domestic violence. Another of the great causes of the Second Awakening was women's suffrage, because with so many women now throwing themselves into public debate and activism over issues like abolition and temperance, naturally many of them started to wonder why they couldn't vote themselves. I mean, the irony was not lost on them that they were fighting to extend citizenship and ultimately the vote to enslaved people when they were denied that same right themselves. And it's why so many of the leaders of the early women's suffrage movement got their start as activists for abolition and temperance. And it's also why it's no accident that the Seneca Falls Convention was held in Seneca Falls, which is in western New York State, the heart of the burned-over district. That's not to say that everybody associated with the Second Awakening came out in support of women's suffrage. There were preachers and leaders of other parts of the movement that thought women's suffrage was taking things a step too far. But there were plenty of others, including many of the giants of the movement, who came to see women's suffrage as one of the core causes of their movement. And that included people like Henry Ward Beecher or Garrison. When this awakening spirit hit America, most Americans translated this new spirit into action through the lens of the Great Revival. But other Americans used alternative moral and religious and spiritual frameworks to achieve the same end. It saw the birth of new religious movements, things like the Latter-day Saints or the Seventh-day Adventists or the Free Love Oneida community. There was Transcendentalism, which was a philosophical spiritual movement that sought to identify divinity in ordinary things. There was explosive growth in the Unitarian Church, and there was sudden new interest in seances and the occult. It also transformed the issue of abolition into one that helped push the country towards an inevitable civil war. See, when you look at all of the normal causes we talk about for the Civil War, the ones that we've talked about previously in this series, things like the Mexican-American War adding so much new territory to the Union, or the blunders of the Compromise of 1850, the disasters of Bleeding Kansas, the implosion of the Whigs, the mistakes of James Buchanan, all of them ultimately are answers not to the question of why, they're answers to the question of how. How did the Civil War happen? The answer to the question of why it happened, it always inevitably comes back to the Second Great Awakening, to the addition of so many impassioned activists for abolition who were now looking at the issue and unwilling to compromise. They saw it as a moral issue that had to be resolved at any cost, urgently and now. So why did the Second Great Awakening happen? Well, here's the theory there. The Second Great Awakening flourished right when the first generation of Americans came of age who had grown up after the American Revolution. The founding generation, they were scarred by war, and they were really focused on all the ways their new republic could conceivably go wrong. But this new generation of Americans, they had grown up amid the building era, and they were looking around at their new republic and thinking about all the ways that it might be better. And they, unlike their predecessors, were more willing to tear things down, to take a union that was imperfect and in ways unjust and wrong, and transform it to make it better. They were infused by moral politics. And infused by moral politics, they were on a mission to transform America and the world. America marched off to war under the banner of the Second Great Awakening. And if you've ever actually listened to the lyrics of the anthem of that war, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you can see the way the two were intricately intertwined. I mean, the height of that song has the lyric, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." But all that moral fervor, it gradually got ground down by the horrors of that war, followed by all the violence and turbulence of Reconstruction. So by the end of Reconstruction, the Second Great Awakening had finally pretty much burned itself out. And America entered a new era, an era of corruption and building and making money, the era that we call the Gilded Age. But then, around the turn of the 20th century, it all happened yet again. This time, there was a new religious revival, one built around the ideas of the social gospel. And there was also a new moral revival and a new movement demanding significant social reforms, the movement that we call the Progressive Movement. America was about to launch its third Great Awakening. Thanks a lot for watching, and if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give it a like. And make sure you tune into the next episode, because we're going to be talking about the third Great Awakening.